I have spent 31 years studying grizzly bears in the state of Montana, not studying them from a distance, not reading reports about them, but getting close enough to count the individual guard hairs on a subadult male, close enough to smell the carrion on their breath, close enough to watch a sow discipline her yearling cubs with a swat that would knock a grown man off his feet. I have field tagged 412 individual grizzlies in my career. I know how they move, how they think, how they escalate from curious to dangerous in a sequence that is as readable to me as a page of text. I have never been mauled. I retired from the United States Forest Service in 2019 with an unblemished field record, and my colleagues used to say it was because I understood bears better than bears understood themselves. I am telling you this because the only way what happened in August of 2017 makes any sense at all is if you first understand that I was not a man who frightened easily in the wilderness. I was not a man who misidentified animals in the dark, or who panicked, or who saw things that were not there. I spent 31 years not seeing things that were not there. And then, on the night of August 9th, 2017, something stepped out of the timber at the edge of our campsite and stood between my family and a grizzly sow that outweighed me by 300 pounds. And that something was not a bear. Before we get into it, let me know where you're watching from and if you've had an encounter like this. My name is Gary Lund. I spent my entire professional life with the Forest Service out of the Flathead National Forest in northwestern Montana, based primarily out of the Hungry Horse Ranger District, but ranging across the entire Flathead system and into the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex when the research demanded it. I grew up in Kalispell, 40 miles west of Glacier National Park, and I came back to that corner of Montana after graduate school at the University of Montana in Missoula because there was nowhere else in the world where I wanted to be. The Flathead Drainage, the Bob Marshall, the Great Bear Wilderness, the Scapegoat Wilderness. All of it combined into the largest contiguous wildland complex in the lower 48 states outside of Alaska, roughly 1.5 million acres of roadless backcountry, where a grizzly bear can travel 100 miles in any direction without crossing a paved surface. It is bear country in the truest and most complete sense of the word, and I gave my career to understanding the animals that live there. My wife Karen grew up in Columbia Falls, which is even closer to the mountains than Kalispell, and she had her own relationship with the wilderness long before she met me. She is not a scientist. She taught 4th grade at Columbia Falls Elementary for 27 years, and she is, without question, the toughest person I have ever personally known. She has backed down a moose that charged our truck on the road to Essex. She once extracted a fish hook from her own palm using a pair of needle-nose pliers from the toolbox in our truck because we were 20 miles from the nearest town, and she did not consider it an emergency. She grew up in a family that spent every August in the backcountry, and she had been on more wilderness trips than most professional guides by the time we married in 1989. I tell you this because what happened in 2017 shook her as nothing had ever shaken her before, and she is not a woman who shakes. Our son Matt was 34 years old in the summer of 2017. He worked as a structural engineer in Missoula, a solid, methodical man who applied the same careful logic to every problem he encountered, personal or professional. He had grown up hiking and camping with Karen and me, and by the time he was in his 20s, he was a more skilled backcountry traveler than most adults I knew. His daughter Lily was 8 years old that August, and it was her first extended backcountry trip. Matt had been taking her on overnights since she was 5. Short trips on maintained trails with a full campsite at the end, but the Bob Marshall was a step up. 3 nights in a legitimate wilderness area with no roads, no cell service, no trails maintained to any particular standard after the summer burn season. Matt had asked me about the trip for several months before we went, wanting to make sure Lily was ready, wanting to make sure the timing was right given the bear activity and the drainage we were planning to use. The South Fork of the Flathead River is one of the most productive grizzly habitats in the continental United States. I had spent more time in that drainage than anywhere else in my career, and I knew its bear population on an almost individual basis. The South Fork corridor running through the Bob Marshall Wilderness supports one of the densest grizzly populations in the lower 48, with territory overlap and seasonal movement patterns I could have described in a graduate seminar. In August, the bears are focused on late summer foraging, building the fat reserves they will live on through denning, huckleberries, cutthroat trout in the shallows, army cutworm moths on the alpine scree, carrion when they find it. They are not looking for trouble with humans during this period. They are focused on calories, and a human campsite represents calories only if food is improperly stored. I had chosen our campsite with the same attention to detail that I applied to every field operation of my career. We camped on a gravel bar on the east bank of the South Fork, roughly a mile and a half above the confluence with Young's Creek. The site was open on 3 sides, meaning I could see across a full 180 degrees of approach from the tent. The timber came in close on the western side, a wall of old Engelmann spruce and subalpine fir that followed a small bench above the river. I hung our food and every scented item in our camp from a bear hang 20 feet off the ground and 50 feet downriver from the tents, using a throw bag and a setup I had been using in bear country for 30 years. All cooking was done on a small backpacking stove with no open flame, which reduces odor dispersion. We ate downriver of the camp and washed our dishes in the river sand. Every item of clothing that had absorbed cooking odors went into a sealed dry bag and into the bear hang alongside the food. These are not optional precautions in the Bob Marshall. They are baseline protocols. The difference between a bear walking through your camp out of curiosity and a bear tearing your camp apart because you made yourself a target.
Quick thing before we get into it. I have a book coming out. It's called the Bigfoot Codex. It's a compilation of all my research and findings. It's kind of my baby. So if you want to check it out, links down below. And let's get you back to the video.
Lily handled the first full day better than I expected. She was a serious kid, a child who asked questions and actually listened to the answers. And she had been briefed by her father with what I can only describe as thorough parental thoroughness. She knew the bear protocols. She knew not to run if she saw a bear. She knew what to do with bear spray. Though at 8 years old, she would not have been able to deploy it effectively, which was why Matt, Karen, and I each carried a can on our hip at all times. She waded in the shallows of the South Fork and collected rocks with the focused intensity of a geologist. And she fell asleep in her sleeping bag before 8:30 that first night, worn out in the healthy way that only real physical activity and clean air produces. The first night passed without incident. I woke twice with the low-level alertness that a career in the field builds into you whether you want it or not. Checked the camp perimeter with my headlamp, heard nothing, and went back to sleep. The second day we hiked about 4 miles up the drainage toward the headwaters, gaining elevation into the subalpine zone where the timber thinned and the landscape opened into meadows ringed by peaks. We saw fresh grizzly sign twice, digging in a patch of glacier lilies, where a bear had been excavating the bulbs, and a set of tracks in a muddy seep at the edge of a meadow that measured just over 11 inches from toe to heel, which told me we were in the territory of a large adult. Not unusual in that drainage, not alarming. Bears leave sign everywhere in the Bob Marshall in August, and the presence of sign is not a threat. It is just information. What I noticed, and did not remark on to the others, was that the tracks in the seep were accompanied by a second, smaller set. The smaller prints measured about 7 inches. A yearling, which meant what I was reading was a sow with at least one cub still in close company, which changes the risk calculus. A sow with cubs is the most dangerous configuration of grizzly bear you can encounter in the wild. Her defensive aggression is triggered more easily, her threshold for a bluff charge is lower, and her commitment to a real charge is higher. I filed the information and adjusted my level of attention accordingly. I did not tell Lily or Karen about the cub tracks. I told Matt when we stopped for lunch, away from the others. He nodded and adjusted the placement of his bear spray without being asked. That evening back at camp, the quality of the light was the kind that makes the Rockies look like a painting someone has not quite finished. The peaks to the west caught the last of the sun long after the river bottom had gone into shadow, and we ate our dehydrated meals, watching the snow on the high ridges go from white to gold to a deep amber that held for about 10 minutes, and then was gone. Lily declared it the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. Karen told her she would see it again many times in her life if she was lucky. I hoped that was true. I went to sleep that second night with the specific alertness of a man who has read a sign in the field that he has not shared. Not fear, awareness. There is a difference. And after 3 decades in grizzly country, you learn to live in the awareness without letting it tip into the fear. Fear makes you clumsy. Awareness keeps you sharp. I woke at 2:17 in the morning. I know the time because I had a watch on my wrist and I checked it by instinct when I came awake, because knowing the time is a field habit, the same way you note cloud direction and wind shift and the smell of the air. I did not know immediately what had woken me. The river was running at its standard summer murmur. Maybe 300 feet from where we lay, the wind was light, coming down from the west off the peaks, which in that drainage usually dies to almost nothing after midnight. The spruce and fir on the bench above our campsite were still, and then I heard it. Not a sound exactly, more the absence of the ambient sounds that had been running underneath the river noise all night. The small rustlings in the brush that are mice or voles or a ground squirrel moving through its territory. The intermittent wing beats of an owl working the gravel bar. All of that had stopped, and the absence of it, to a man who has spent enough nights in that country, is as loud as an alarm. I sat up in my sleeping bag and reached for my bear spray without making any fast movement. I unzipped my tent door about 6 inches and looked out. There was enough ambient starlight, augmented by a quarter moon that was just clearing the ridge to the east, for me to see the gravel bar in front of the tent and the river beyond it. There was nothing on the gravel bar. I listened. The river. The wind. Nothing else. I widened the tent door and leaned out further so I could see the western approach, toward the timber on the bench. The sow was at the edge of the tree line. She was standing broadside to the camp, head swinging slowly from side to side in the low, rhythmic sweep that is a grizzly's primary method of processing olfactory information. She was a large animal, what I estimated at between 350 and 400 pounds, which put her in the upper range for an adult female in that system. Her coat in the moonlight was the silver-tipped brown that gives grizzlies their common name, the individual guard hairs catching the light at their tips, so she seemed to have a faint luminescence at the edges of her silhouette. And 10 feet behind her, tucked close to the first row of spruce, was the yearling. One cub, the same animal whose tracks I had read in the afternoon seep. I did not move. I did not call out to Karen. I did not reach for the zipper of our sleeping bag or make any action that would produce sound. I watched. The sow took 3 steps toward the camp. Slow, deliberate steps, each one placed with the particular care of an animal that is assessing whether to commit. Her head came up and she stood at full height for a moment, sampling the air. Then she dropped to all fours and took 2 more steps. She was 40 feet from our tent. I heard Matt's tent zipper move a half inch, then stop. He was awake. He had heard a sound, or felt a shift. The same animal alertness we had built into him since he was old enough to walk these mountains. I held absolutely still. The sow took another step and her head went down. Not in a threat posture, in the posture of an animal that is focused on a specific smell and is moving toward the source. She was not charging. She was not bluff rushing. She was investigating, which is in some ways more dangerous because it is more deliberate. A bluff charge is noise and speed and usually stops. An investigation can end in a contact that happens before anyone has time to react. I was calculating. 40 feet. Bear spray is most effective at distances under 30 feet. I had a clear shot from my current position if she came 2 more steps. Karen was asleep on the other side of the tent and did not yet know what was outside. Matt was in his tent 8 feet to my right with Lily. His tent was between me and the bear. I made the decision to call out. A firm, human voice at range is the standard response to an investigating bear, and I had used it successfully dozens of times in my career. It asserts human identity without triggering flight instinct, which in a sow with cubs can convert instantly to defensive aggression if she believes she needs to protect her yearling. I opened my mouth, and then the timber behind the sow moved. Not the way timber moves in wind. Wind moves branches from the top down and side to side with an evenness that comes from the pressure being applied across a broad area. This movement came from a specific body passing through the trees from north to south, an object bending the lower branches and then holding them as weight passed across them, and then released them in sequence as the weight moved on. I have watched enough large animals move through dense timber to read the pattern of that movement, and what I was reading was something large moving on two legs, because the branch disturbance was happening at a consistent height rather than the varying heights you see from a quadruped moving through brush. The sow heard it before I could process what I had seen. Her head came up, and she spun 90 degrees to face the timber with a speed that always surprises people who have not watched grizzlies move. They do not look fast until they are fast. And then they are very fast. She faced the tree line in a high alert posture, front feet planted wide, head up, ears forward, and she made a sound I have heard grizzlies make in the presence of threat, not the huffing warning vocalization that precedes a bluff charge. A different sound, lower, almost a moan, the sound of an animal that is uncertain about what it is facing. Something stepped out of the timber onto the bench above our campsite. I am going to describe what I saw as exactly as I can, and I am going to use the language of a man who spent 31 years describing what he saw in the field, which means I am going to resist the temptation to use words that do not come from direct observation. I am 68 years old. I have a master's degree in wildlife biology from the University of Montana. I have spent more nights in the Bob Marshall wilderness than most people spend in their home state. What I saw that night I could not identify, and I have spent 6 years since that night attempting to identify it, and I have failed. It was upright, fully upright, on 2 feet, in the manner of a human being, rather than a bear rearing in a threat display. I know the difference between a bipedal bear and a bipedal primate because I have seen bears rear on their hind legs hundreds of times, and the postural difference is not subtle. A bear rearing is a bear balancing against its own weight, with its spine curved and its arms out for counterbalance, and its center of gravity clearly behind its hind feet. What I was looking at had its center of gravity directly over its feet, its spine vertical, and its arms at its sides, and it was standing that way with the casual ease of an animal that stands that way all the time. It was large. In the field, estimating the size of an animal against an environment you know thoroughly is something you do automatically after enough time, and I was looking at the bench above our camp against a tree line I had studied from our campsite all day. The Engelmann spruce at the edge of that bench averaged between 50 and 60 feet in height, with the first branches beginning at roughly 12 to 14 feet. What I was looking at was standing directly adjacent to one of the smaller trees at the bench edge, and the top of its head cleared the first branch cluster of that tree by what I estimated at 2 to 3 feet. That would place it at somewhere between 8.5 and 9 feet in height. And that is a conservative estimate accounting for the angle of the bench and the difficulty of night estimation. It was covered in hair. Not the close, uniform pelage of most mammals I had studied, but describes most mammals I have studied, but the longer, coarser hair of a primate, hair that moves individually in a breeze, and that catches light differently than a pelage of fine, uniform coat. In the moonlight, the color read as dark, a brown-black that blended with the timber shadows so thoroughly that when it stood still it would have been almost impossible to distinguish from the trees. It was not standing still when I first saw it. It was moving, stepping out of the timber onto the bench with a gait that was deliberate and unhurried, and then it stopped. It stopped, and it looked at the sow, not at us. At the sow. And then it took one step forward, off the bench edge, and stood between the sow and our campsite. The sow made that low moan again and took a step back. The yearling behind her scrambled further into the timber, and the sow half turned toward it in the instinctive check a mother makes for her offspring before facing a threat again. She faced the thing on the bench. She was 400 pounds of apex predator with a cub behind her and every evolutionary imperative she possessed telling her to hold her ground or escalate. And she did neither. She turned and walked into the timber after her cub. I have watched grizzly bears interact with wolves, with black bears, with bull elk in rut, and once with a bull moose that would not yield a trail. I have watched a grizzly back down a pack of wolves, and I have watched a grizzly run from a moose that was willing to commit. I have never, in 31 years, watched a grizzly sow with a cub behind her turn and walk away from anything she could see clearly in open ground. They do not do that. Defensive aggression in a sow with cubs is one of the most reliable and well-documented behavioral constants in ursine biology. They bluff, they charge, they commit. They do not simply turn and leave. She turned and left. I sat in the opening of my tent, and I did not breathe. The thing on the bench stood there for what I estimate was 30 to 40 seconds. It did not look at the camp. It did not make any move toward us. It stood the way something stands when it is listening. Its head turned slightly, so that one ear faced downhill in the direction the bears had gone. Then it turned and stepped back into the timber, and the branches moved in that same sequence as it passed through them, north to south along the bench, and then it was gone. Karen's hand touched my shoulder from inside the tent. She had been awake. I do not know for how long. She did not say anything. I reached back and put my hand over hers, and we sat there in the silence of the river and the wind for a long time. Matt's voice came from his tent, barely above a whisper. He asked if I had seen what just happened. I told him I had. He asked what it was. I told him I did not know. Lily was asleep. She slept through the entire thing. Through whatever combination of grace and exhaustion allows an 8-year-old to sleep through what her grandfather and her father and her grandmother could not make sense of. She woke up the next morning and ate oatmeal and asked if we could go look for tracks in the mud at the seep again. And we took her there, and we found the sow's tracks from the previous day exactly where we had found them before, and we did not find any other tracks. And I told Matt that evening, when Lily was asleep in the tent again and Karen had gone to wash the dishes, that this did not surprise me as much as it should have, because I had been carrying something for 23 years before that night in the Bob Marshall. Not a secret exactly, more like an unresolved observation that I had set aside because I could not explain it and because my professional standing depended on not saying things I could not explain. I had been a field biologist for the federal government for 3 decades. And federal field biologists do not file reports about things they cannot identify. We file reports about things we can measure, verify, and replicate. I had spent 23 years measuring and verifying and replicating other things, setting aside the one thing I could not explain, and then the thing I could not explain put itself between my family and a grizzly bear, and whatever professional caution I had been practicing for 2 decades lost its hold on me. This is what happened in 1994. I was working a population monitoring transect in the Spotted Bear Drainage, which is a major tributary of the South Fork of the Flathead, about 15 miles north of where we camped in 2017. Late October, early in the morning, air temperature around 24 degrees, 8 inches of new snow on the ground from a storm that had moved through the previous night. Fresh snow is the best tracking medium in existence, and I was working slowly, recording every print I encountered along the transect, photographing and measuring and recording GPS waypoints for each one. I had been in the field since 5:30 in the morning, and I was about 6 miles from my truck. I came around a bend in the drainage and found a set of tracks in the snow that were not in my reference library. I want to be precise about this too, because the temptation in telling a story like this is to reach for dramatic language. and dramatic language is how you get dismissed. So here are the facts. The tracks were bipedal. They came from the south, following the east bank of Spotted Bear Creek at a distance of about 15 feet from the water's edge, and they continued north until they entered a dense stand of lodgepole pine and disappeared into the timber. They were human in shape, with 5 distinct toe impressions, a ball and heel, an arch that was more pronounced than in most human tracks I had seen, but recognizable as an arch. They were not bear. I have measured and photographed thousands of bear tracks in my career, and bear tracks are immediately and unambiguously distinguishable from human-shaped tracks. These were human-shaped. They were 17.5 inches long. I measured them 3 times with the flexible tape I kept in my field kit. I photographed them from multiple angles with the disposable camera I carried for field documentation at that time. I measured the stride length, which was 62 inches, meaning roughly 5 feet between successive prints of the same foot. I measured the step width, the distance between the center of the left print and the center of the right, which was 11 inches. For reference, my own tracks in that snow measured 13.5 inches in length, with a stride of 34 inches and a step width of 4 inches. The dimensions of what I was looking at were not within any range of variation I had encountered in human tracks. The stride length alone was nearly double what a tall man covers in a walking gait. I followed the tracks north for 2 miles before they entered the lodgepole stand, and the combination of needle drop from the overhead canopy and wind breaking through the canopy in gusts had degraded the impressions to the point where they were no longer measurable. I spent 40 minutes in that stand of lodgepole and found 3 additional partial impressions in sheltered depressions where the snow had remained intact, but I could not reconstruct a continuous trail from the fragments. I went back to my truck and sat in it for about an hour. What a field biologist does, with an unidentifiable track, set in a system they know thoroughly, is file a report and submit the photographs. That is the correct professional response. The report gets reviewed. The photographs get looked at by people with more experience in the specific domain, and if the finding is significant, it generates a formal investigation. That is how science is supposed to work. I did not file a report. I drove back to the Hungry Horse Ranger District office, developed the photographs at the 1-hour photo place in Hungry Horse, put the prints in an envelope, and put the envelope in the bottom drawer of my desk, and I did not open it for 6 years. I have thought a great deal about why I made that decision. It was not cowardice, or at least I do not believe it was entirely cowardice. It was the particular kind of institutional awareness that comes from spending enough time inside a bureaucratic science organization to understand exactly what happens to the people who report things that do not fit the existing framework. I had watched a colleague in the Lolo National Forest, a serious and well-regarded wildlife biologist named Jim Garvey, submit a report on anomalous track evidence he had found in the Selway drainage in 1989. The report was reviewed and dismissed. Jim was not disciplined, but a particular subtle pressure began to shape how his subsequent work was received, how his grant applications were evaluated, how his findings were weighted in interdepartmental discussions. The tracks he had found were not the same dimensions as what I found in the Spotted Bear, but the institutional response to the anomalous finding was clear enough. You did not advance your career by reporting things you could not explain. You advanced your career by explaining things. So I put the photographs in the bottom drawer and I explained other things for 6 years. In 2000, I was transferred from the Hungry Horse Ranger District to the supervisor's office in Kalispell, a promotion of sorts that came with more administrative responsibility and less time in the field. I miss the field the way anyone misses the work they were built for when they are pulled away from it, and I arranged as many field assignments as I could justify to keep myself out of the office and in the drainage systems where I had spent my career. It was on one of those self-assigned field days, in June of 2002, that the second thing happened. I was doing a site assessment in the upper reaches of the Gordon Creek drainage, which flows into the South Fork from the east, about 12 miles above the Spotted Bear confluence. It is remote country even by Bob Marshall standards, accessed by a trail that sees maybe 20 visitors in a typical summer. I was alone, which was technically a protocol violation for solo backcountry work in grizzly habitat. But I had been working alone in grizzly country for 28 years at that point, and the protocol had never felt as pressing to me as it perhaps should have. I had set up a field camera station on a game trail at the edge of a willow thicket about 200 yards off the main creek. Game cameras were becoming practical field tools by 2002, and I had a set of them deployed across the drainage system for ongoing population monitoring. I was checking the memory card on this particular camera when I heard something in the willow thicket that was large enough to move the willow stems from the base rather than the tips. Willows move from the top in wind and from the base when something is walking through them. I stood up and looked at the thicket. It was mid-morning. Good light. No wind. I could hear the willows moving at a distance of maybe 60 feet from my position. Whatever was moving through them was moving parallel to my position, south to north, without any change in pace that would indicate it had detected me. The willows at that location were between 10 and 12 feet tall, and I could see the tops of them bending in a wave that tracked the movement of whatever was inside them. Then the movement stopped, not gradually, the way an animal stops when it decides to wait and assess, all at once. Like a switch being thrown, the willows went still. And then, very slowly, the tops of two willow stems at the northern edge of the thicket separated, moved apart as if being held open from below, and I was looking at a face. I use that word with intention. I am aware of what it implies. It was not a bear face. It was not a face organized around a muzzle and forward-set nasal structure in the manner of any bear species. The features were arranged in a broadly flat configuration with pronounced brow ridges above deep-set eyes, a nose that was wide and low-bridged but structured more like a primate nasal structure than a bear's, and a jaw that was heavy and broad but organized along horizontal rather than muzzle-forward lines. The eyes were dark, brown-black in the light, and they were looking directly at me. I looked back. This lasted for what I estimate was 8 to 10 seconds. And then the willow stems were released, and the movement in the thicket resumed, this time moving north and then east, back toward the main creek drainage, and within 30 seconds there was no sound or movement from the thicket at all. I walked to the spot where the face had appeared. The ground at the base of the willow stems was soft mud, and there were two clear impressions there, each one oriented side by side in the configuration of a biped that had stopped and crouched slightly. The left impression measured 16 inches in length. The right was partially obscured by a willow root, but measured at least 14. I photographed everything. I measured everything. I recorded it in my field notebook in the same detail I used for every data point in my career. And then I drove back to Kalispell and put everything in the bottom drawer with the spotted bear photographs. And I did not open the drawer again until the summer of 2012. What changed in 2012 was Karen. Not Karen changing, but Karen finding the envelope in the drawer during what she described as a systematic clean-out of the home office that I had been refusing to do for years. She brought the envelope to me at the kitchen table on a Saturday morning in July, unopened, and said she assumed it was mail I had not gotten to and would I like to go through it now. I agreed, which was easier than explaining why the answer should have been no, and I opened the envelope at the kitchen table, with Karen sitting across from me drinking her coffee. She looked at the photographs for a long time. She looked at the field notebook entries I had made. She asked me when these had been taken, and I told her. She asked me why they were in the bottom drawer, and I told her the truth, which was that I had not known what to do with them, and I had been afraid of what doing the right thing professionally would cost me. She was quiet for a while after that. Then she said that she thought the fear had cost me, carrying it alone for all that time, and that she wished I had shown her sooner. We talked about it for most of that afternoon, not what it meant in any scientific or institutional sense, but what it meant to us, to a man who had organized his entire professional life around the careful documentation of the natural world and had twice encountered something the natural world had no official place for. Karen said that in her experience, the things people could not explain were not necessarily the things that needed to be explained. Some things were just true whether they fit anywhere or not. She had grown up in the mountains. She was not entirely surprised. I told her about the Gordon Creek face. I had not told anyone about that before. She listened to the whole account without interrupting, and when I finished, she asked 2 questions. She asked whether it had seemed afraid of me. I told her it had not seemed afraid. She asked whether it had seemed threatening. I told her it had not seemed threatening either. She said that seemed about right, and refilled her coffee. And that was the most significant conversation of our 33 years of marriage. I am not a man who makes dramatic changes in his approach to things. I kept working at the supervisor's office. I did not file belated reports on the spotted bear tracks or the Gordon Creek face. I finished out my career and retired in 2019 without ever entering any of it into the official record. I have thought about whether that was the right decision many times, and I still do not know. What I know is that by the time we took Lily into the Bob Marshall in 2017, I had been carrying 3 data points that did not fit any framework I had been trained in, and when a 4th arrived that August night, it did not shock me the way it should have shocked me. It did not feel like the first time. It felt like confirmation of something I had been trying not to confirm for 23 years. Let me tell you what happened after that night. Not immediately after. Immediately after was Karen and Matt and I sitting in the gravel bar camp for the rest of the night without sleeping, talking in low voices about what we had all seen, reaching no conclusions, watching the sky go from black to dark blue to the gray that precedes dawn in the mountains, watching Lily sleep through all of it in her sleeping bag. I mean, what happened in the weeks and months that followed, because what happened in those weeks and months was not what I expected. I expected the event to fade, not disappear, but soften around the edges the way memories do when they compete with the daily texture of normal life. Field events faded for me. Encounters that had seemed significant in the moment receded to data points when enough time had passed. That is how field work is done, and you do not carry the emotional weight of every encounter forward, or the accumulated weight of them would make the work impossible. I expected the Bob Marshall event to go the same way. It did not. What happened instead was the opposite of fading. The event stayed specific and clear, as only the most significant experiences remain specific and clear. When you remember the exact quality of light at a moment when something fundamental shifted. I could close my eyes 6 months later and see the thing on the bench with exactly the same fidelity as the moment I had seen it. I could hear the sound the sow had made. I could feel Karen's hand on my shoulder. None of it dimmed. Matt was similarly affected. We talked on the phone about once a month after the trip, and the Bob Marshall event came into almost every conversation, sometimes directly and sometimes through the side door of some other topic that related to it. He had more to lose professionally than I did. I was already retired. But he was also younger and less settled in his sense of what the world was, which made him more willing to examine the event with a direct gaze. He did not reach any conclusions either. He reached what he described to me as a held uncertainty, which he said was different from doubt because doubt implies you are comparing 2 possibilities, and uncertainty is more like standing at the edge of a territory you have not mapped. I thought that was about right. Karen took a direction I would not have predicted. She started reading. Not casual reading, but the systematic kind she applied to anything she wanted to understand, going through material with the same methodical attention she had given to teaching for 27 years. She read everything she could find on reported sightings in the Pacific Northwest and Northern Rockies, with what she described as a journalist's skepticism, discarding the accounts that seemed to her fabricated or attention-seeking, and noting the ones that had the texture of genuine observation. She did not tell me what she was doing for the first few months. When she told me, I asked her what she had found. She said she had found a great deal of noise and a recurring signal. The signal was the thing she had seen on the bench above our campsite. Lily came back to the memory. Eventually. Not in a frightening way. And not immediately. It came up about a year after the trip, when she was 9. In a conversation with Matt one evening, she had been watching a nature documentary about bears, and she asked her father, in the matter-of-fact way of a 9-year-old, whether the big thing in the trees had been the bear's friend. Matt said he was not sure what she meant, and she said the big thing that came out of the trees the night the bear was outside, the one that made the bear go away. Matt called me that evening. He said his daughter had not been asleep. I have turned that over many times. An 8-year-old in a sleeping bag, watching through the mesh of a tent, not making a sound, seeing what the adults were seeing and drawing from it the uncomplicated conclusion that the large thing in the trees and the bear were engaged in some kind of relationship. Not predator and prey, not threat and response. Friend, she said, the bear's friend. I do not know what to make of the word friend. I am a wildlife biologist. I do not typically reach for that word in describing interspecies interaction, but I have not found a more accurate word for what I watched unfold on that gravel bar in 2017, and I have been looking for one ever since. There is a particular quality that a career in wildlife biology gives you that takes a long time to name and longer still to examine. It is a particular kind of humility, the professional kind. The kind that is beaten into you by the repeated experience of being wrong about things you were certain about. I was certain, in 1981, that the grizzly population in the Flathead system was functionally stable and did not require the level of human management intervention that some of my colleagues were advocating. I was wrong. The subsequent decade showed population pressure in the eastern districts that I had underestimated by a significant margin. I was certain, in 1993, that a wolf reintroduction program in the Flathead drainage would displace grizzly foraging in the riparian corridors by summer. I was wrong. The interaction between wolves and grizzlies in the system turned out to be far more complex and, in certain respects, more complementary than I had modeled. I was wrong about these things, and dozens of others, and each time being wrong forced me to revise my model of what the landscape was and how the animals in it behaved. The experience of being consistently humbled by the complexity of a system you thought you understood is either the beginning of wisdom or the end of certainty, and I am not sure those are different things. What it produces, after enough time, is a particular disposition toward evidence. You stop reaching for explanations that confirm what you already believe. You start letting the evidence tell you what it is, even when what it is does not fit. I had, by 2017, accumulated 4 pieces of evidence. The spotted bear tracks in '94, the Gordon Creek face in 2002, the 2 things Karen had found in her reading that she thought bore the same signal as the rest, and then the bench above our campsite. 5 pieces of evidence if you count Karen's reading. And I do count it, because Karen is a rigorous reader, and she was not looking for confirmation. She was looking for the pattern that the evidence traced. And when she found it, she showed it to me, and I could not dismiss it. I want to be specific about the 2 accounts Karen flagged, because specificity is the only thing that makes any of this credible, and credibility is the only currency I have left to spend in a story that would be dismissed by every professional organization I spent my career working for. The first was an account published in 1998 in a small regional newspaper out of Libby, Montana. A retired Forest Service trail crew supervisor named Howard Belloc had written a letter to the editor describing an encounter he had in the Kootenai National Forest in the summer of 1986 during a trail reconstruction project on the Yak River drainage. Belloc was working alone on a section of trail that required him to move materials from a cache point to a work area about 300 yards distant, and on his 3rd trip between the 2 points he encountered a set of bipedal tracks crossing the trail at a right angle. He described the tracks in the letter, and the dimensions he gave were consistent with what I had found in the spotted bear. He was not, by his own account, a man prone to this kind of thing. He had spent 30 years with trail crews in some of the most remote national forest land in the lower 48 and had never encountered anything he could not identify. He was writing the letter, he said, because he was 71 years old and he wanted to have said it at least once. The second account Karen found was more recent, 2011. A hunting guide working out of Augusta, Montana, the town that sits at the eastern edge of the Bob Marshall Wilderness, had posted on an online forum describing an incident during an elk season pack-in to the upper Sun River drainage. He had been moving a string of horses along a trail at first light when the entire string stopped and refused to move. He described what he saw when he looked ahead on the trail. A large, upright figure at the edge of the timber that watched the string for approximately 20 seconds and then moved into the trees. The horses required 45 minutes to calm enough to continue. The guide was not asking anyone to believe him. He posted with a first name only and an account handle that did not correspond to any business he was advertising, which meant he was not trying to generate attention for his operation. He seemed to be doing the same thing Howard Bellack had done in his letter to the Libby editor. Having said it at least once, I read both accounts. I read a great deal more of what Karen had collected, and she was right that most of it was noise. But those two were signal. The specific, reluctant, unproductive kind of signal that comes from people who have evidence to report and no good reason to report it and do so anyway because they cannot continue not saying it. I have now arrived at the same point. I cannot continue not saying it. I am 68 years old. My professional career is complete, and my professional standing no longer needs protecting. My family knows what happened in the Bob Marshall in 2017, and Matt has asked me, more than once, what I intended to do with the knowledge I had accumulated. The honest answer, for a long time, was nothing. I intended to do nothing with it, because I did not know what doing anything with it would mean. What changed was Lily. She is 15 now. She came to stay with us last summer, and on the second evening, she asked if we could go for a drive up into the mountains before dinner, because she wanted to see the peaks before the light changed. We drove up the road toward Glacier, and she sat in the passenger seat with the window down and the evening air coming in, and she said, without any preamble or introduction, that she thought about the night in the Bob Marshall sometimes. I told her I thought about it too. She said she wanted to know what it was, not because it scared her, but because she felt like she was carrying a question she had not asked. I asked her what the question was. She said the question was whether it had known what it was doing, whether it had come to the edge of the timber on purpose because they were there and needed help, or whether it had simply been there and the situation had resolved in their favor by coincidence. I thought about that for a long time as we drove. Then I told her what I believed, which is the most honest thing I can say and is the closest thing I have to an answer. I believe it knew. I have spent 31 years studying animal behavior, and the behavioral sequence I observed on that gravel bar in August of 2017 was not the behavior of an animal responding reflexively to stimuli in its environment. The movement through the timber was deliberate and directional. The placement between the sow and the campsite was precise. The duration of the stand was measured, maintained until the sow had committed to retreat, and then ended. It was the behavioral sequence of an animal that had assessed a situation, made a decision, and executed the decision. I have watched every large predator and prey species in the northern Rockies behave in thousands of combinations of circumstances, and what I saw on that bench was goal-directed behavior, not instinct, intent. Whether that intent was protective in any sense that the word protective means when applied to humans is a question I cannot answer. I can describe the behavior. I cannot speak to the inner life that produced it. I am a wildlife biologist, and wildlife biologists describe behavior. We do not, as a rule, attribute motive, but in this case, I am no longer speaking as a wildlife biologist. I am speaking as a grandfather. And as a grandfather, I will tell you what I believe. I believe that whatever came out of that timber in the early hours of August 10th, 2017, understood that there was a child in those tents. I believe it acted in a manner consistent with the protection of that child. And I believe that if any of us had been in danger before that moment in any of the nights I had spent in the Flathead and the Bob Marshall over the course of my career, we had perhaps been safer than we knew. There are people in the research and reporting community who have been documenting this topic seriously and without fanfare for decades. They are not, by and large, the people you see on television programs about unsolved mysteries. They are the unglamorous, persistent kind of people who make careful records and ask careful questions and accept that the answers may not come in their lifetimes. I have not joined them, because joining them would require a public commitment to a position I am still not able to hold with the certainty that position demands. But I have read their work, and I have recognized in their most careful and specific accounts the same texture of genuine observation that I trust in my own field notes, and that Karen trusted when she was sorting signal from noise, and that Howard Belleck was trying to communicate in his letter to the Libby editor when he said he wanted to have said it at least once. I have now said it. I want to end with the South Fork. Not the event on the gravel bar, but the river itself. Because the river is the thing I want people to understand who have not spent time in that country. The South Fork of the Flathead runs for roughly 65 miles through the heart of the Bob Marshall Wilderness before it empties into Hungry Horse Reservoir just above the dam. In those 65 miles, there is not a single road crossing, not a single developed campsite in the National Recreation Area sense, not a single facility of any kind. The Forest Service maintains a trail system through the drainage, but trail maintenance in the Bob Marshall is not what it is in a national park. The trails exist, and they are kept passable in most years by the efforts of the trail crews and the outfitter organizations that run horse parties through the country. But they are not trails that invite casual use, and the terrain on either side of them is not terrain that casual hikers penetrate. In a typical year, the upper South Fork drainage above Young's Creek sees somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 individual visitor days in 65 miles of drainage. For reference, the most visited trail in Glacier National Park, the Trail of the Cedars, near Apgar, sees that many visitors in a week. The Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex as a whole encompasses about 1.5 million acres. 1.5 million acres of terrain that is, in significant portions, visited by fewer than one person per square mile per year. That is the scale I am talking about when I say that the country out there is not fully known. Not by scientists, not by the Forest Service, not by the outfitters who have worked it for generations, and certainly not by anyone sitting in an office deciding what is and is not possible in the mountains of northwestern Montana. I spent 31 years in a small piece of that country, and I encountered things I could not explain. I do not believe I was uniquely positioned to encounter them. I believe they are there to be encountered by anyone who spends enough time in that terrain, with enough patience and enough willingness to sit with an observation that does not fit. The gravel bar at the South Fork confluence of Young's Creek is not a special place, in the sense that nothing marks it as different from 10,000 other gravel bars in that drainage. It is just a place I was sleeping on the night something decided to stand between my family and a bear, and I have not gone back there without thinking about that when I sit on the riverbank in the evening and watch the light die on the peaks, and I have not looked at those peaks without understanding, in a way I did not fully understand before 2017. How much country there is behind them that nobody has walked. Karen and I still go back every summer, not always into the Bob Marshall proper, but into the Flathead system, up the roads that turn to gravel, and then to two-track, and then end at the trailheads where the wilderness boundary begins. We sit at the edge of that country and we watch it, and sometimes in the early morning or the last light of evening, when the timber on the ridge above the river is dark against the sky, I watch the tree line, not looking for anything, just watching, the way you watch a system you have spent a career trying to understand, with the particular attention of a person who knows how much is happening in the country behind what he can see. Matt and Lily came out with us 3 summers ago. Lily was 12 by then, long past the age where what she had seen and not seen in the Bob Marshall was something that happened to someone else. She sat at the campfire on the first night and looked at the tree line above us with the focused attention I recognized from her childhood rock collecting, that quality of noticing she had always had, and she said, without looking away from the timber, that she hoped it was still out there. Matt asked her what she meant. She said, the thing that helped them. She hoped it was still there in the mountains, and that it was all right. I said I hoped so too. I meant it. I have been carrying this story for 6 years since the night in 2017, and for 23 years before that, in pieces I did not know how to connect. I have carried it in the way you carry something that has no proper place to be set down, not because it is too heavy, but because the furniture of ordinary life was not built to hold it. I am setting it down here because Lily asked me her question in the car on the road to Glacier, and because Howard Bellack wrote his letter to the Libby editor, and because Karen found the signal in the noise and showed it to me, and because the thing I believe to be true has been true long enough that the keeping of it private feels less like discretion and more like a failure of honesty. I was a wildlife biologist. I spent 31 years telling the truth about what I observed in the field. What I observed on the evening of August 9th, 2017, in the South Fork of the Flathead River drainage of the Bob Marshall Wilderness is part of the same record. It belongs in that record. I am putting it there. The South Fork is still running. The Grizzlies are still in that country. The Spotted Bear drainage and the Gordon Creek and the Upper Youngs Creek tributaries. The huckleberries still ripen in August on the south-facing slopes, and the cutthroats still run the riffles at the tail of the pools, and the Engelmann spruce on the benches above the river have been growing since before anyone who reads this was born. I was in that country for 31 years, and I never felt afraid of it. Not truly afraid in the way some people are afraid of wild places. I felt, most of the time, the particular privilege of being somewhere that asks nothing of you except your attention. The night of August 9th, 2017. That country gave me something in addition to asking for my attention. I have tried to be equal to the gift. I am not sure I have succeeded, but I have told the truth of it, which is the only thing I know how to offer, and which is, I think, what the truth deserves. I need to go back further than 2017 to tell this properly. I need to go back to the years before the Spotted Bear tracks, back to the beginning of my career in the Bob Marshall country, because the thing I have spent 6 years trying to understand did not begin for me on that gravel bar. It began earlier, in a way I did not recognize at the time as beginning anything. And I think the earlier part matters as much as the night the Grizzly turned and walked away. I arrived in the Flathead drainage in the spring of 1988, fresh from my master's program at the University of Montana, with a degree in wildlife biology and a thesis on habitat connectivity in grizzly populations of the northern Rockies. I was 26 years old, newly married to Karen, and I was starting a position as a seasonal field biologist with the Forest Service that, if things went well, would convert to a permanent position at the end of the season. Things went well. By October of that first year, I had a full-time appointment and a work territory that covered roughly 200,000 acres of the most productive grizzly habitat in the continental United States. My supervisor in those first years was a man named Roy Carver. Roy had been working the Flathead drainage since 1964, which made him the institutional memory of the entire landscape, and he was generous with that memory in the way that people who have genuinely loved a place are generous. He took me into the field himself during my first 2 months, working transects he had been running for 20 years. And he taught me the country the way you teach a person to read, starting with the most basic letters and working toward the sentences that only make sense once you know all the letters. The letters, in Roy's system, were the physical landscape, how the drainages channeled bear movement, how the south-facing slopes differed from the north-facing slopes in their plant communities, and therefore in their food values, how the late-season snowpack on the high ridges determined where the elk wintered and therefore where the wolves and bears would follow. Once you understood the landscape, the animals in it became readable. Once you understood the animals, the anomalies became legible. Roy had been in that country for 24 years when I arrived, and he had anomalies he had not resolved. He did not tell me about them immediately. He waited, the way he waited on everything, until the right moment presented itself. The right moment, in Roy's case, was a November evening in my first year when we were coming off a long day on a transect in the upper Spotted Bear country and stopped to make camp on a bench above the creek. We had a fire going, which Roy permitted himself in the late season when the risk of spreading it was negligible, and we were eating the sandwiches he had packed and watching the last of the light fail on the peaks, and Roy said, without any particular introduction, that there were things in this country he had been unable to account for. I asked him what he meant. He told me about tracks he had found in 1971, his 7th year in the field. He described the dimensions and the stride and the placement, and I recognized immediately what he was describing because it matched almost exactly what I would find myself 23 years later in the Spotted Bear snow. He said he had found similar evidence 3 more times over the following 15 years, always in the same general corridor between the Spotted Bear and Gordon Creek drainages, always in October or November when the other field personnel had largely rotated out of the area. He had filed none of it. He had told no one. He was telling me, he said, because I was going to be in this country for a long time if I stayed, and he thought I should know what I might encounter and how he had decided to handle it when he encountered it himself. I asked him how he had decided to handle it. He said he had decided to treat it as you treat any ongoing presence in a system you are studying. You note it, you document it privately, you do not disturb it, and you do not publicize it, and you proceed with your work because the work is what matters, and because anything you publicize will be taken out of your hands and handled by people with less patience and less knowledge of the specific country than you have. He said the best thing that could happen for whatever was leaving those tracks was for the people who knew the country best to know about it and choose to protect the knowledge. He said the worst thing that could happen was for someone with a television crew or a university grant and no field experience in the Flathead drainage to start making noise about it, because that kind of noise attracted exactly the attention that a large, unmapped animal does not survive. I thought about what Roy said for many years. I still think about it. He was applying to an anomalous finding the same conservation logic that wildlife biologists apply to sensitive species populations. The logic that says the protection of a species sometimes requires restricting information about its location and habits, because information creates pressure and pressure destroys habitat and disrupts behavior and eventually kills what you were trying to study. I was not sure, sitting by that fire in 1988, whether the logic applied to something we had not identified and could not study in any conventional sense. I was not sure the logic applied at all. I was 26 years old, and I had been in the field for 8 months, and Roy had been in the field for 24 years, and I was smart enough to understand that the gap between those 2 measures of experience was worth more than any theoretical position I could construct in opposition to his. So I listened, and I noted what he had told me, and I continued my work. Roy retired in 1996. His retirement party was held at the Forest Service office in Hungry Horse, and about 40 people came, which for a district that size and a county that size is a significant gathering. He and his wife moved to Whitefish, 20 miles south of Kalispell, and I visited them every few months for the first few years, and less frequently as his health began to decline. He died in 2008, at the age of 74. At his memorial service, his wife Dorothy told me that he had specifically asked her to make sure I received the journals from his field years. She delivered 3 cardboard boxes of composition notebooks covering his entire career from 1964 to his retirement. I went through every one of them. Roy had been more systematic in his private documentation than I had been. He kept separate sections in the relevant notebooks for what he called his anomalous observations, marked with a red vertical line in the margin to distinguish them from routine field notes. There were 11 such entries spanning from 1967 to 1993. The dimensions varied across the entries, prints ranging from 15 inches to just over 18, but the stride lengths and step widths were consistent in the ratios that indicate a single bipedal type rather than multiple animals of different sizes. His most recent entry was from the autumn of 1993, 1 year before I found the spotted bear tracks myself, describing a set of tracks near the Spotted Bear Ranger Station that measured 17.5 inches in length, the same dimensions as mine from the following year. I sat with Roy's journals for 3 evenings going through the anomalous entries, and what struck me most was not the physical evidence, which largely confirmed and extended what I already knew from my own documentation, but the tone of the entries themselves. Roy was a precise and economical writer. His routine field notes were dense with data and almost entirely free of personal reflection. They were still precise and still economical, but they had something running underneath the precision that the routine entries did not have, a kind of care. Not wonder exactly, but the particular careful attention that a person pays to what they have decided to protect. He did not speculate about what he was finding. He did not try to explain it. He just described it in the same language he used for grizzly tracks and wolf sign and elk movement, and moved on to the next day's work. But the way he described it, the patience and the detail, suggested that he had come to regard whatever was leaving those tracks as part of the system he was responsible for, as something in his care, the way the grizzlies were in his care, and the wolves and the cutthroat and the old growth stands along the creek bottoms. I put Roy's journals in the filing cabinet in my home office alongside my own documentation. The Flathead National Forest has a visitor center in Hungry Horse that sees a modest number of tourists in the summer months, mostly people who have come to see Hungry Horse Reservoir or who are staging for trips into Glacier. The visitor center has interpretive displays about the natural history of the drainage, the geology, the plant communities. There is a good display on grizzly bears that I helped the interpretive staff develop in the 90s. It covers the history of the grizzly in the northern Rockies, the recovery of the population following the listing under the Endangered Species Act in 1975, the habitat requirements and seasonal behaviors of the flathead grizzlies, and the coexistence protocols for recreationists in bear country. It is a good display. It represents the state of scientific knowledge about the species accurately and accessibly. There is no display about anything else. I do not say this as a criticism of the Forest Service or the interpretive staff. They display what is known. What is known has been rigorously established through decades of field research, peer review, and institutional consensus. What Roy spent 27 years quietly documenting, and what I spent 23 years quietly adding to Roy's documentation, is not known in any institutional sense. It exists in cardboard boxes of composition notebooks in a filing cabinet in a house in Kalispell, and in a manila envelope in the same cabinet, and in the memories of 4 people who were on a gravel bar on the South Fork of the Flathead on the night of August 9th, 2017. That is the extent of its institutional existence. I have made a decision. I am not, at 68 years old, going to file those records with any scientific or governmental body. I reached that decision slowly, and for reasons I think are defensible. The documentation I have is strong for private observation and weak for institutional peer review. It does not include biological samples, acoustic recordings, or any form of evidence that would survive the standards required for formal scientific review. The photographs I took in '94 and 2002 are clear enough to be meaningful to someone who is already familiar with the territory and the dimensions of the tracks, and meaningless or dismissible to someone who is not. The field notes are consistent and careful, but they are field notes written by a man who spent his career believing, on some level, that what he was documenting would never be examined by anyone but himself. They are not the field notes of a man preparing a peer-reviewed paper. They are the field notes of a man keeping faith with what he saw. What I can do, and what I am doing, is say it plain. I spent 31 years in the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex and the Flathead National Forest and the surrounding wilderness areas, and I found evidence, 4 separate times across 23 years, of a large bipedal animal in the upper South Fork drainage that I could not identify, and that does not correspond to any cataloged species in the North American biological record. My mentor, Roy Carver, spent 27 years in the same country and found similar evidence 11 times across his career. And on the night of August 9, 2017, I watched a creature that I could not identify step out of the timber on a bench above the South Fork of the Flathead River and stand between my family and a grizzly bear until the bear turned and walked away. I am not asking anyone to take this on faith. I do not take things on faith. I'm due. I am asking you to consider the evidence that I have described as carefully as you would consider any other evidence, with the same willingness to follow it where it leads, rather than to the conclusion you arrived with. That is the standard I applied to my work for 31 years. It is the only standard I know how to offer. Now let me tell you about the structure of the Bob Marshall Wilderness, because I think the geography matters more than most people realize when they are trying to understand how something large could persist in that landscape without being definitively documented. The Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex includes the Bob Marshall Wilderness proper, the Great Bear Wilderness to the north, and the Scapegoat Wilderness to the south. Together they form a contiguous block of roughly 1.5 million acres, stretching from the southern boundary of Glacier National Park in the north to the edge of the Lincoln area in the south, and from the Rocky Mountain front on the east to the Flathead River Valley on the west. The complex is roadless. Not a single road, maintained or unmaintained, within its external boundary. Not a 2-track, not a logging spur. Nothing. The only access is by trail or by air, and the trail system covers a fraction of the terrain. The vast majority of the complex is cross-country travel only, which in the northern Rockies means deadfall, cliff bands, creek crossings, and terrain that does not permit consistent human movement at any pace faster than about a mile an hour. The watershed complexity alone makes large-scale survey work effectively impossible. The Bob Marshall is drained by dozens of major creek systems, each breaking into multiple tributary drainages with bench systems that may not see a human visitor for years at a time. I've been in drainages in the upper Spotted Bear country, where the last documented human visit in the Forest Service records was a trail crew in the 1980s. In the Great Bear Wilderness to the north, portions of the terrain are so remote that the Forest Service does not maintain trail access at all. These are not areas that have been thoroughly searched for anything. They are areas that have been entered, briefly and rarely, by people with specific reasons to be there. The grizzly population I spent my career studying was present in that landscape for decades before the first systematic scientific surveys. The surveys did not create the grizzlies. They documented what was already there. I have thought about this parallel many times, and I find it holds up to the scrutiny I applied to everything in my working life. Something was in the upper Spotted Bear drainage in October of 1994. Something was in the Gordon Creek drainage in June of 2002. Something was in the Bob Marshall Wilderness in August of 2017. These events were separated by years and by miles, and they did not all constitute encounters with the same individual animal. The landscape is too large and the events are too spread to attribute them to a single animal with a defined territory. What they constitute, if they are what I believe they are, is a population using the wilderness complex in the same way that the grizzly population uses it, ranging widely, responding to seasonal food availability, remaining mostly invisible because the landscape is large enough and complex enough and seldom enough visited by humans to accommodate a cautious animal with good reasons to avoid contact. A grizzly bear has good reasons to avoid human contact. It has been hunted for centuries and has learned, across those centuries, the particular wariness of an animal that knows human beings respond to danger by eliminating it. The grizzly populations I studied in the Flathead were not the bold, curious bears of national park campgrounds. They were wild bears that moved through terrain I was working in without my ever knowing they had been there. I would find sign of their passage after the fact, the displaced soil and the tracks and the claw marks on trees, and the picture that emerged was always of animals that had treated human presence as something to navigate around rather than engage with. If there is an animal in the northern Rockies that has had equal or greater reason to develop that same behavioral heritage, it is whatever has been leaving those tracks. Whatever has been moving through the Spotted Bear and Gordon Creek drainages for at least the 50 years that Roy's documentation and mine together cover. It has every reason in the world to be careful, and it is careful. I want to say something about the night of August 9th, 2017, that I have not said yet, because I have been building toward it, and this is the right place to say it. I was afraid, not of the grizzly, though a grizzly sow with a yearling cub at 40 feet is a genuine and significant physical danger. I was afraid of the sow in the way that a trained and experienced response to that specific danger feels. Not the freezing, incapacitating fear of someone who has no framework for what is happening, but the acute and functional fear of someone who understands exactly what is happening and is processing options. I had a can of bear spray in my hand. I knew the distance. I was calculating. When the thing came out of the timber, the fear changed. I want to be precise about the nature of the change, because it is the thing that has stayed with me most clearly from that night, and that I have thought about most in the years since. The fear did not intensify when the large, unknown thing stepped onto the bench. It was replaced, not gradually and not partially, but completely and almost instantly replaced. The only word I have for it is recognition, which is strange because I did not recognize what I was looking at. I had never seen it before. I could not name it or categorize it or file it in any reference system I had been trained to use. And yet what I felt when I saw it was not the sharp escalation of fear that you feel when a larger threat appears, but closer to the feeling you have when a situation that was deteriorating stops deteriorating. Not relief exactly. Resolution. The sense that the situation had changed, and that it had changed in a direction that reduced rather than increased the danger we were in. I do not know what to make of that phenomenologically. I am a scientist, not a philosopher, and I am not equipped to explain what it means that a 61-year-old wildlife biologist with 31 years of field experience felt the fear leave his body when an unknown animal of undetermined species stepped out of a tree line 40 feet from his family in the middle of the night. I can report it as a data point, the same way I reported the dimensions of the tracks and the behavioral sequence of the sow, and I will leave the interpretation to whoever has the tools for it. What I can say is that the feeling was consistent with the behavior I subsequently observed. It was not a misreading of the situation. The situation resolved in the direction the feeling indicated it would resolve. Karen told me, when we talked about it the next morning after Matt had taken Lily down to the river, that she had felt the same thing. Not at the same moment. She had been asleep when the thing came out of the timber, and she had come awake just before it stepped onto the bench. And for a brief moment, she was aware of the grizzly, and then aware of both the grizzly and the thing on the bench. And in that moment she told me what she felt was that the sow was going to leave. She did not know why she thought that. She just felt it. With the same certainty with which you feel the change in a room when a tension has resolved. She said she did not feel afraid of the thing on the bench. She felt, in her words, that it was paying attention to us, not to her specifically, but to the camp as a whole. The same way a responsible person pays attention to a situation they have decided to involve themselves in. She said it felt like being noticed by something that had decided you were worth noticing. I have turned that phrasing over many times. Worth noticing. It implies a value judgment, and value judgments imply the capacity to make them, and the capacity to make them implies a faculty I am not equipped, professionally or personally, to define. But I cannot dismiss what Karen said, because Karen is the most careful observer I know, and she was looking at the same thing I was looking at, and she described what she observed with the same precision she brought to the 27 years she spent observing children in a classroom and reading what was happening in them and responding to what she read. What she read on that gravel bar in the early hours of August 10th, 2017, was that we were worth noticing, and that having noticed us, the thing on the bench had done something about what it noticed. I will close with what I know, because I started with what I know, and I want the story to end in the same place it began. I know the Flathead drainage. I know the South Fork of the Flathead River and the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex that it drains. I know the grizzly bear population in that system at a level of detail that I spent 3 decades building. I know what a grizzly sow with a yearling cub does when she perceives a threat, and I know what she does not do, and what she does not do is turn and walk into the timber without committing to either charge or retreat on any terms other than her own. On the night of August 9th, 2017, a grizzly sow with a yearling cub turned and walked into the timber. She did it because something stepped out of the timber on the bench above our campsite and stood between her and our tents, and because whatever that something communicated in the act of standing there was enough to make her leave. I watched this happen from a distance of 40 feet. My wife Karen watched it. My son Matt watched it. My granddaughter Lily, who was 8 years old and was supposed to be asleep, watched it. We all saw the same thing. We have all described the same thing. We have reached, collectively, the same conclusion. Not that we understand what we saw, but that what we saw was real, and that it acted with intention, and that the intention, whatever it was rooted in, and whatever it cost, was toward us rather than against us. That is what I know. That is the truth of it. And I have said it now, at 68 years old, in the only language I know, which is the language of a man who spent his life looking carefully at the natural world and trying to tell the truth about what he found there. The South Fork is still running. The wilderness is still there, and I am still watching the tree line. There is a particular kind of field work that does not appear in any grant proposal or scientific paper. It is the work of being present, without agenda, in a specific piece of landscape over a long period of time. Wildlife biologists talk about this informally among themselves. The fact that the most significant observations in a career rarely happen when you are collecting data for a specific project. They happen in the margins, in the time between the formal work, when you are traveling between transect points, or waiting at a camera station, or sitting by a creek eating lunch, and your attention is free from the disciplined focus that formal data collection requires. In those intervals, you see things you were not looking for. I saw a great deal in the margins of 31 years in the Flathead drainage. Most of it was ordinary in the sense that it was explicable and classifiable. Notable only in that sense in which everything is notable when you are paying close attention to a living landscape. A great blue heron working a riffle at dusk, absolutely still with the particular stillness that only herons achieve, and then striking with a precision that looks like machine action. A wolf pack crossing the frozen surface of a beaver pond in the early dark of a January morning. Single file. The tracks they left in the snow so neat and orderly they looked planned. A bull moose in September. Neck swollen from rut, standing thigh-deep in a willow-choked marsh, and stripping leaves from the branches around him with the focused efficiency of an animal that has decided that this is the task, and the task will be completed. These things are not dramatic. They are just true. They are the texture of a place that is functioning the way it is meant to function. And spending time in that texture changes the way you understand what the natural world is. In the spotted bear drainage in the early 1990s, I was running a population monitoring protocol that required me to check a grid of hare snares every 10 to 14 days from late spring through early fall. Hare snares are a non-invasive way of collecting genetic material from grizzlies. You run a strand of barbed wire at shoulder height for a bear along a trail or through a thicket, bait the interior of the enclosure with a scent lure, and when a bear passes through and rubs against the wire, you collect the hair samples that catch on the barbs. The protocol was developed in the early 90s and was one of the primary methods for population monitoring before we had the aerial telemetry and camera technology that is standard now. It was labor-intensive and required regular attention to each station in the grid, which meant I spent a significant amount of time in the spotted bear drainage during those years, much more than the formal field schedule required. I had 22 snare stations in the spotted bear grid, distributed across an area of roughly 60 square miles. Each station had to be checked, the bait replenished if it had been consumed or degraded, the barbed wire inspected for damage, and any hair samples collected, labeled, and preserved for genetic analysis. A full check of the grid took 3 to 4 days depending on conditions, and I ran the circuit every 12 to 14 days from late April through early October. Over the 6 years I ran that protocol, I walked the spotted bear grid roughly 15 times per season, or somewhere in the range of 90 full circuits of the country during that period. I knew that drainage, as well as you know a room you have lived in for years. Every beaver pond and willow, flat and rocky bench and scree slope was mapped not just on the topographic sheets I carried, but in the specific memory of a person who has crossed the same ground dozens of times in different seasons and different weather conditions. I knew where the elk bedded on the north-facing slopes in July. I knew which creek crossings became impassable in high water and which remained fordable regardless of runoff volume. I knew the specific Engelmann spruce that a large male grizzly had used as a marking tree for at least 3 years running, rubbing his back against the bark at a height that told me he stood nearly 8 feet at the shoulder, the largest individual I was tracking in that system. I knew the country. In the fall of 1992, I started finding things in the spotted bear country that were not part of what I knew, not dramatic findings. Not anything that would make a field note with an exclamation point. Just small accumulations of evidence that, individually, I could explain, and collectively, over the course of that season, began to form a pattern I did not have a framework for. The first was a hair snare station on the upper fork of a tributary that fed into Spotted Bear Creek from the north. The station had been set in the same location for 3 seasons, and in those 3 seasons, I had recovered grizzly hair from it approximately 2/3 of the times I checked it. In the fall of '92, I checked it on a Tuesday in the 3rd week of September and found the barbed wire had been pushed upward, all the way to vertical, in a manner inconsistent with a bear passing under it. Bears push through barbed wire or push it aside or occasionally snap it. They do not, as a rule, carefully lift it vertical and then continue moving through the station. The displacement I found required something to have stood upright inside the snare area, moved the wire overhead, and then moved out through the other side. The bait was untouched. There were no grizzly hairs on the wire. There were no tracks in the soft ground around the station that I could attribute to a bear. There were 2 impressions in the soil on the downhill side of the station. Partial impressions, not complete enough to measure with confidence, but shaped in a manner not consistent with any quadruped I could name. I photographed them and continued my circuit. 2 weeks later, at a different station about 4 miles to the northwest, I found the same situation. Wire lifted vertical, bait untouched, no grizzly hair, and this time a complete print in the bank of the stream that ran 15 feet from the station. The print was human in shape but not in scale, and I measured it at 14 3/4 inches before the bank crumbled slightly at the heel margin. I photographed it and continued my circuit. I did not tell anyone. I want to be honest about that. The correct scientific response to an anomalous finding in a monitored field system is to document it carefully and report it through the appropriate channels so that the anomaly can be evaluated by people with broader expertise. I did not do that. I did what Roy had done before me, which was to note the evidence and continue working. And I told myself the same thing Roy had probably told himself, which was that there was not enough to report yet, that more data was needed before any conclusion could be drawn. That justification was partly true and partly a way of managing something I was not ready to examine directly. The following season, 93, I found 3 more anomalous snare interactions and 2 more partial track sets. By 94, when I found the full track set in the October snow, I had a private record of 7 unexplained snare interactions and 4 partial track findings, none of which had been reported, and all of which were consistent with the same type of evidence. Bipedal, large, moving through the spotted bear drainage, with a deliberateness that suggested familiarity with the terrain rather than incidental passage. Whatever was moving through that country was not lost there. It was home there, the way the grizzlies were home there, the way the wolves and the elk and the moose were home there. It was moving through familiar ground. The October 94 tracks were the confirmation of what the previous 2 seasons had been building toward, and they were also the point at which I made a decision that I have turned over in my mind many times in the years since. I had, at that moment, a coherent 2-year body of evidence from a rigorously monitored field system that documented the recurring presence of a large bipedal animal in the spotted bear drainage. The evidence was from my own direct observation, collected under the same protocols I applied to all my field data, documented with the same precision. It was as strong as any anomalous field finding I had ever encountered, and I put it in an envelope and locked it in my desk drawer. I told myself I was protecting the animal and the knowledge of it. Roy's reasoning was in my head. Publicity creates pressure. Pressure destroys habitat. The best outcome for whatever was leaving those tracks was for the people who knew the country best to know about it and keep quiet. I believe that reasoning. I still believe parts of it. But I also know that part of what I was protecting was myself, my career, my institutional standing, the professional identity I had spent 20 years building. Both things were true at the same time, and I have been honest with myself about both of them. What I did not do in the years after 1994 was stop paying attention. I continued the spotted bear protocol through the mid-90s and into the late 90s, and I continued finding anomalous snare interactions at a rate of about 2 per season, always in the same general corridor along the upper tributary drainages. After the transfer to the supervisor's office in 2000, I ran the spotted bear grid less frequently, but I ran it when I could justify the field time, and the pattern held. The interactions continued. Whatever was using that country was using it consistently across more than a decade of observation. And then the Gordon Creek face in 2002, which I have already described, which was not evidence in the technical sense because I had no photograph and no physical impression to document. It was direct observation by a trained wildlife biologist with 30 years of experience identifying animals in the field at a distance of 60 feet in good light. I know what I saw. I cannot prove it in any scientific forum. I know what I saw. In the summer of 2003, I went back to Gordon Creek. Not in any official capacity. I went on a personal day, alone, with a newer camera than the one I had been carrying in 2002. I spent 2 full days working the willow thicket and the surrounding bench, looking for any physical evidence that would support or contradict what I had observed the previous June. I found one partial impression in a muddy area near the creek bank that was consistent with a large bipedal track, but it was too degraded to measure or photograph usefully. I found nothing else. I sat by the creek on the second afternoon and thought about what it meant to spend a career in a place and still not know everything that lived there. I thought about the mountain lions in the Flathead system that had been present for decades before the first verified photographic documentation in the 1970s. I thought about wolverines, which inhabited every major mountain range in the northern Rockies, but were so secretive and so low density that the Forest Service had minimal systematic knowledge of their population structure or movement patterns even after years of targeted research. I thought about the wolves that had crossed into the Flathead drainage from Canada beginning in the late 1980s, moving quietly through a landscape that humans moved loudly through, and had no idea the wolves were there until a rancher in the Stillwater drainage found tracks in the snow in 1991. Large animals live in large landscapes and move through them quietly. And the humans who move through those same landscapes are loud and infrequent and leave the trails only with difficulty. The arithmetic of that reality is not complicated, and it does not require any exceptional explanatory framework. It just requires accepting that what has been documented is not the same as what exists. I accepted that a long time ago. It was accepting what I had specifically documented, specifically in the Spotted Bear and Gordon Creek drainages, and specifically in the Bob Marshall on the night of August 9th. That took longer. The morning after the encounter on the gravel bar, we broke camp methodically and walked out. It was 6 miles to the trailhead at the end of the road to Young's Creek, and we walked it in about 3 hours on a trail that follows the river south through the wilderness boundary and into the national recreation area where vehicle access is permitted. The morning was clear, high pressure, the kind that follows a still night in the mountains, and the South Fork was running green and cold between gravel bars that caught the early light. Lily walked the whole way without complaint and without, as far as I could tell, any residual distress from whatever she had seen or not seen in the night. She was interested in the morning. She was interested in a dipper working the rocks at a riffle crossing, and she was interested in a fresh grizzly bed she found at the edge of a willow flat, and she was interested in the mushrooms that had pushed up through the duff in the shade of a spruce stand after the summer damp. She was 8, and she was paying attention, and the world kept offering her things to pay attention to. Matt and Karen and I walked and did not talk much. There was not much to say that could be said on a trail in single file, and there was a great deal to say that needed more than the 20 feet between us on a narrow path to be said in. We would talk. We knew we would talk. The talking would come, and it would go on for a long time. At the trailhead, while we were loading packs into the truck and Lily was crouched over a ground squirrel hole at the edge of the parking area, Matt asked me one question. He asked whether I thought it had followed us. Not in a frightened way. In the specific, methodical way, he asked every question. I told him I did not know, but I did not think so, because what I had observed the previous night was behavior consistent with a territorial response to a situation, rather than behavior consistent with tracking or following. It had addressed the situation. It had resolved it. And then it had returned to the timber from which it had come. That was not the behavior pattern of an animal that was focused on us specifically. It was the behavior of an animal that had dealt with something in its territory and gone back to its own business. Matt nodded and finished loading his pack. He did not ask any more questions that day. In the fall of 2017, about 2 months after the trip, I drove up to the Spotted Bear Ranger Station on a Tuesday in October. The station is staffed seasonally and by late October is usually closed for the winter, but the road to it is maintained through most of the fall, and the drive up the South Fork Road from the Hungry Horse Reservoir is one I had made many times over the years. I drove it that afternoon not because I had anything specific to do there, but because I needed to be in that country for a while and I needed to think. I sat by the South Fork for about 2 hours in the afternoon light. The river was low at that time of year, the summer snowmelt long gone and the fall rains not yet enough to bring it up to winter levels, and the gravel bars were broad and pale in the October sun. I had brought Roy's journals with me, the 3 boxes from the filing cabinet, and I sat with them by the river and read the anomalous entries again, starting from the first one in 1967 and working forward through the 11 entries to the last in 93. What I was doing was computing the full span of the record. Roy's observations began in 1967. Mine ended, for formal purposes, with the Gordon Creek face in 2002. Together, those 2 bodies of evidence covered a continuous period from 1967 to 2002, 35 years of documented anomalous evidence in the same general drainage system, and then the encounter in 2017, 15 years after the most recent formal documentation, in a campsite about 12 miles from the heart of the Spotted Bear corridor that Roy and I had been monitoring. 35 years of evidence, then a 15-year gap, then a clear, direct, witnessed encounter with the thing the evidence had been pointing at. The gap was not a disappearance. I understood that. 15 years in a landscape the size of the Bob Marshall complex, during a period when I was spending less time in the specific corridor that Roy and I had been monitoring and more time in administrative work, is not a meaningful absence of evidence. It is an absence of a specific observer in a specific place. Roy died in 2008. I was in the supervisor's office in Kalispell from 2000 until my retirement in 2019, and while I made field trips throughout those years, I was not running systematic protocols in the spotted bear drainage during that period. The anomalous evidence I had documented between 1992 and 2002 represented 6 to 8 years of active, regular monitoring of a specific corridor. After 2000, the monitoring stopped. That does not mean the evidence would have stopped if someone had been there to find it. In 2019, the year I retired, I went back into the spotted bear drainage one last time as a federal employee. Not on official business. I arranged the field time as a personal trip using the access my position provided. And I walked the corridor that Roy and I had monitored across the span of our careers. I walked it for 3 days, the same circuit I had walked 90 times during the snare monitoring years, and I looked for evidence. I found 3 things. A partial impression in the soft mud at the edge of a beaver pond on the upper tributary, human-shaped, partial enough that I could not take a confident measurement but large enough that I could rule out any human visitor. A bent and held branch at the edge of a willow thicket in a pattern consistent with what I had seen at the Gordon Creek thicket in 2002. And, on the 3rd morning, about 100 yards off the main trail at the base of a large Engelmann spruce, a nest of gathered material, not the elaborately woven nesting structures of some primate species, but a pressed-down accumulation of dried grass and spruce boughs that had been arranged against the base of the spruce in a configuration that broke the wind from the north and held body heat against the trunk. The material in it was not fresh, but it was not from the previous year either. Sometime in the past season, something large had slept at the base of that tree. I photographed all 3 findings. I added the photographs to the filing cabinet. I drove back to Kalispell. Retired life has given me time I did not have during my working years. Time to read, time to walk, time to sit at the kitchen table with Karen over a long breakfast and talk about things that 31 years of early mornings and long days in the field did not leave much room to talk about. I have used some of that time to go through the full body of documentation that Roy and I accumulated together across our careers, treating it the way I would treat any significant field data set, with the same rigor I would apply to anything I was preparing for publication. Not to publish it, to understand what it says. What it says, stripped of every hedging qualification and presented in the plain language of a wildlife biologist summarizing a field study, is this. The upper South Fork drainage of the Flathead National Forest in northwestern Montana, and specifically the corridor between the Spotted Bear and Gordon Creek tributaries, has supported a recurring population of large bipedal animals from at least 1967 to at least 2019. The population uses the drainage seasonally, with the highest evidence density occurring in October and November, which is consistent with a large mammal in the pre-denning period building fat reserves and moving at higher rates across its territory. Evidence density is highest at elevations between 4,000 and 6,000 feet, which corresponds to the subalpine zone below the winter snowpack line. The population appears to avoid direct contact with humans while monitoring human activity in the drainage from distances of 30 to 200 feet, as evidenced by track sets that consistently parallel human trails without crossing them except at specific, defensible crossing points such as narrow ridges or single log crossings over creeks. In 3 direct observation events across the study period, the subject animals made no threatening moves toward the observing humans and retreated or ceased observation after the human observer became aware of them. That is the summary of the record, not embellished. The summary of a field study conducted across 52 years by 2 qualified observers in a specific piece of terrain in the northern Rocky Mountains of Montana. The last thing I want to say is about Lily, because she is the reason I am saying any of this at all. She called me this past February from Missoula on a Sunday evening when I was sitting in the reading chair by the window that looks north toward the mountains. She had been assigned a research project in her high school biology class about apex predators in the northern Rockies and wanted to talk to me about grizzly bears. We talked for about an hour. She asked good questions. At the end of the conversation, she said she had one more question. She asked if I had ever gone back to the place where we had camped in 2017. I said I had not camped in exactly that spot again, but I had been in the drainage many times since and intended to go back in the summer. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said she wanted to come. Just the two of us. She said she had been thinking about it since she asked me her question in the car on the road to Glacier, about whether the thing we had seen knew what it was doing, and she felt the question deserved to be asked in the place where it happened. I said yes, and told her we would go in August when the huckleberries were on and the river was running well. She said she would be ready. I do not know what we will find when we go back. I do not know if we will find anything at all, or if the question Lily has been carrying will be answered or even approached by being in that specific piece of country on a specific evening in August, with the peaks going gold in the last of the light and the South Fork running clear and cold between the gravel bars. What I know is that I am 68 years old, and my granddaughter is 15, and we are going to sit on the east bank of the South Fork of the Flathead River above the Youngs Creek confluence and watch the timber on the bench above us, and whatever happens, we will be paying attention. That is all any of us can do. Pay attention. Tell the truth about what we see. Stay in the country long enough to know it, and be honest about the parts we do not know, which are most of it. The Bob Marshall Wilderness is still there. It is always going to be there, or as close to always as anything in this world gets. 1.5 million acres of roadless mountain country in northwestern Montana, draining south through the Flathead system, holding in its drainages and its old-growth corridors and its subalpine willow flats everything that it has always held, known and documented and cataloged, and also, in the margins, in the places between the transect points and the camera stations and the snare grids, the things that have not been documented yet. I spent 31 years in the margins of that country. I will spend whatever years I have left going back to them, and I will keep telling the truth about what I find there, the way Roy Carver told it to me on a November evening in my first year in the field, in the language of a man who loved a place enough to be honest about everything it contained. There are things about the night of August 9th that I have told in sequence but not fully. The sequence is accurate. The timing is accurate. The description of what I observed is as accurate as I can make it. What I have not told, and what deserves to be told, is the quality of the interval after the thing stepped back into the timber, the 30 to 40 seconds it stood on the bench, which I described, and the 5 minutes after it disappeared, which I did not. Karen's hand was on my shoulder. Matt was awake in his tent 8 feet away. Lily was asleep. The river was running. The wind from the peaks had picked up slightly as it does in the small hours when the temperature inversion breaks and the cold air from the high ridges begins to drain down the drainages. The sow and her yearling were somewhere in the timber to the west, moving in the direction of the upper tributary drainages they had come from. I could not hear them. Grizzlies move quietly when they have decided to move, which surprises most people because of their size, but a 350-pound bear can step through thick timber in near silence when it is not alarmed and not in a hurry. I sat in the opening of my tent for those 5 minutes, and I was, in a way I have not fully described, listening. Not for the grizzly, which I was fairly certain had committed to leaving. Listening in the general, open way you listen when you are in a big country in the middle of the night and you want to know what the country is doing. The wind, the river, the sound of the spruce on the bench moving in the rising air from the drainage, a great horned owl calling from somewhere on the far side of the river, the deep territorial call that carries enormous distances in the still of a clear night in the mountains. Nothing else. Whatever had been on the bench was not making any sound I could detect. and was not making sound I could not detect, which is to say the ambient small noises of the nighttime country had resumed. The voles and ground squirrels were back in their grass stems. The owl continued its territorial call. The forest, which had gone entirely silent in the minutes before the sow appeared at the tree line, was alive again with the routine sounds of the routine night. Karen said, very quietly, that it was gone. Not a question, a statement. I said yes. She thought we should try to sleep. I told her I would sit for a while longer. She understood. I sat for about another half hour, not watching for anything specifically. Just sitting in the way you sit when you are trying to process something that your mind keeps returning to without making progress on it. The moon had cleared the eastern ridge by that point, and the gravel bar in front of the tent was washed in a pale light that made the river look like hammered silver between its banks. The mountains to the west were dark shapes against a sky that was beginning to show the edge of the Milky Way as the moon moved further from the galactic plane. The Bob Marshall in the middle of a clear August night is, in purely physical terms, one of the most beautiful places I have ever been, and I had been there dozens of times, and it had never failed to produce that response. Even that night, with everything I had just witnessed, the country itself was what it always was, a landscape too large to be diminished by anything that happened in it, including the failure of a man with 31 years of field experience to account for what he had just seen. I went back to sleep around 3:30. I do not know exactly when because I stopped checking my watch at some point. I slept until first light, which in the Bob Marshall in August comes around 5:15, and I woke with the clarity that comes from sleeping in the mountains, the immediate awareness of where you are and what the air smells like and what the light is doing. I lay in my sleeping bag for a few minutes and listened to the river and the wind and thought about what I was going to do with the rest of the trip. We had one more night planned at the Youngs Creek Confluence campsite and then a 2-night push into the upper drainage toward the headwaters. I had wanted to show Lily the high country above timberline, the alpine meadows and the permanent snowfields on the north faces and the small tarns that sit in the cirques and reflect the sky. She had never been above timberline. Matt and Karen had both been into that country many times, but Lily's longest trip before this one had been a single overnight, and we had agreed before the trip that the high country push depended on how she was handling the distance and the elevation. I made my decision in those few minutes in my sleeping bag. We were going to stay the additional night at the gravel bar camp, and we were going to make the high country push on schedule, and I was not going to suggest changing the plan based on the previous night's events. This was my granddaughter's first real wilderness trip, and I was not going to be the person who cut it short because of an event I had not been able to explain. Matt agreed with me when I explained my thinking over breakfast. Karen said she had already decided the same thing and was glad we were all aligned. Lily, who had slept through the entire discussion by sleeping through the entire event that occasioned it, ate her oatmeal with blueberries from the bag we had brought and asked if we could walk to the head of the gravel bar and look for the otter she thought she had seen in the lower pool the previous morning. She had seen a river otter. They are present in the South Fork system, though not abundantly, and the ones I had encountered over the years were mostly in the lower drainage near the reservoir. A river otter in the upper South Fork above Youngs Creek was not impossible but was on the less common end of the distribution. I told her I thought she had probably seen one and that we could certainly walk down to look. We did not see the otter again. We saw a mink working the far bank of the lower pool, which is a sufficiently dramatic animal in its own right, and Lily watched it for 15 minutes with a concentration that reminded me of Roy Carver watching something in the field, a quality of focused, patient attention that does not try to make the animal do something, just watches what it does. She would have made a good field biologist. Maybe she still will. The third night on the gravel bar was quiet. I slept in 2-hour intervals and checked the camp perimeter each time I woke. There was nothing to see except the river and the stars and the moving shadows of the spruce on the bench. The sow did not come back. Whatever had been on the bench did not come back. The gravel bar was what it always was, a flat piece of river bottom in the middle of the largest wilderness area in the lower 48, and it conducted itself accordingly. We made the high country push over the following 2 days. Lily handled the elevation gain without complaint and without the altitude headache that sometimes accompanies rapid gain in people who are not acclimatized to it. Matt attributed this to the fact that she had been at glacier elevation earlier in the summer on a day hike he had taken her on. And he was probably right. She saw the alpine meadows and the tarns and the permanent snow and the sky reflecting in the water at 11,000 feet above sea level. And she said what people who see that country for the first time almost always say, which is that they had not known it would look like this. I told her it looked like this every time. She said she was coming back. I told her I knew she would. Karen's research, in the years after 2017. She started corresponding, by email initially and later by letter, with a small number of researchers and field investigators she had identified from their published work as operating at the careful end of the spectrum. Not television personalities or conference circuit people, but the ones whose written accounts had the texture of genuine observation and whose methods were consistent and rigorous. She identified herself as a retired educator with an interest in the subject and asked if she could ask questions about methodology and evidence standards. Most responded. She learned things from them that I, who had spent my career working within a framework that had no place for this subject, had not known to look for. One of the things she learned was about vocalization. The literature in this field, such as it is, includes a substantial body of reported acoustic observations, not the famous recordings from the Patterson-Gimlin site or the various disputed recordings that have circulated in the research community for decades. More recent material, from investigators using standardized acoustic monitoring equipment deployed in wilderness areas, recording and analyzing audio files for sounds that fall outside the known call libraries of identified species. Karen had found a paper, published in a small naturalist journal in 2015, describing a series of recordings made in the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness in Idaho, which is the wilderness area that borders the Bob Marshall Complex to the south and west, that included several minutes of low-frequency vocalizations recorded by an unattended monitoring unit at an elevation of about 7,000 feet. The vocalizations were described as falling in a frequency range below the normal fundamental frequency of any known large mammal in the region, meaning they were lower than the lowest sounds produced by a grizzly or a bull moose or a bull elk, and they were modulated in patterns that the paper's authors described as consistent with intentional communication rather than involuntary vocalization. The paper was cautious. It was cautious in the manner of any paper dealing with anomalous acoustic data in an academic context has to be cautious, citing alternative explanations for the recordings, acknowledging the limitations of the data set, and stopping well short of any claim about what had produced the sounds. But Karen read it in the context of what she had already been reading, and she recognized in the description of those low-frequency sounds something that matched one of the things I had told her from the Gordon Creek face observation. I had described, in that original conversation in the winter of 2012, when I showed her the envelope, a vibration I had felt in the ground while I was standing at the willow thicket. Not a sound I had heard. A vibration. At the time, I had attributed it to the creek running over bedrock somewhere out of sight, which was a reasonable explanation given the terrain. But when Karen read the acoustic paper, she asked me again about that detail, and I told her everything I remembered about it, and she looked at the frequency data in the paper and she said she thought they were probably the same kind of thing. I do not know if she was right. Low-frequency vibrations in a mountain drainage have many potential sources. Bedrock resonance from flowing water is the most obvious. Seismic microtremors are not uncommon in the Idaho-Montana border region, which sits within the influence of the Yellowstone hotspot and its associated tectonic activity. A wind pattern moving through a specific valley geometry can produce infrasonic vibrations that a person can feel in their chest without hearing any obvious source. There are a great many explanations. What I can say is that I have worked in the Bob Marshall country for 31 years, and I have felt ground vibration from all of those natural sources at various times. And what I felt at Gordon Creek in 2002 was different from any of them in a way I could not account for, and chose, at the time, not to try to account for. I do not think Karen was wrong to connect the two things. I think she was doing what a good observer does, which is to notice when two pieces of evidence that come from different sources and different times produce the same description of the same phenomenon. Whether the description corresponds to what she thinks it corresponds to is a separate question that I cannot answer. But the correspondence itself is real, and I have included it here because it belongs in the record, the same way everything else belongs in the record. In the spring of 2021, 2 years after my retirement, I had a conversation with a man named Don Seibert, who runs a hunting and horse-packing outfitting operation out of Choteau, on the Rocky Mountain front east of the Bob Marshall. Don has been running pack strings into the Bob Marshall for 28 years. He is not a man who talks about things he has not personally observed, and he is not a man who embellishes what he has personally observed. He has the particular matter-of-fact quality of people who make their living in terrain that does not permit much in the way of self-deception. Don and I had met through the Forest Service in the late 90s, when his outfitting concession in the Sun River drainage overlapped with some of the monitoring work I was doing in that system, and we had stayed in loose contact over the years. I called him in the spring of 21 to ask about horse access to the upper Spotted Bear drainage for the trip I was planning that summer, the solo trip that turned out to be the 3-day circuit of the old monitoring corridor. He had useful information about trail conditions and crossing points. And then, at the end of the conversation, I asked him a question I had not planned to ask. I asked if he had ever found anything in the Bob Marshall that he could not explain. There was a pause. Don is not a man who pauses before he speaks. He answered questions directly and without hesitation, the way he moved through the field. And, without hesitation, the pause lasted long enough that I became aware of it. Then he said he had. He said it in the same tone he would use to say he had found a section of washed-out trail or a beaver dam across a creek crossing. Neutral, factual, just a thing that was true. He told me about a horse camp in the upper White River drainage, which is a tributary of the South Fork about 8 miles north of the Spotted Bear confluence. He had been running horse parties into that drainage for 15 years and had used the same camp spot, a flat bench above the river with good grass for the horses and a good spring for water, for most of those 15 years. In the fall of 2014, on the second night of a 6-day elk hunting pack trip, every horse in his string broke their picket lines and ran. 12 horses, all experienced mountain animals that had been in that drainage multiple times. They ran south, down the drainage, and he and his 2 guides spent the better part of the following morning recovering all of them from a flat area about 3 miles below the camp where they had collected themselves and stopped. In 28 years of running horse trips in the Bob Marshall, Don told me, he had never had an entire string break picket at once. He had had individual horses panic and break lines. He had had 2 horses go at once during a severe thunderstorm that rolled through the Sun River drainage in 2007. But never 12, and never in conditions that offered no obvious explanation. The night had been clear. There had been no thunderstorm. He had found no sign of a predator at the camp. The horses had simply gone. He found something else at the camp the following morning. When they returned to break it down before going after the horses, he found that a salt lick he had set out for the horses, a 50-pound compressed salt block on a wooden platform that he had placed 20 feet from the horse picket line, had been moved, not knocked over, not broken, not consumed. Moved, set neatly, in his words, in the center of the camp, in the flat area between his sleeping tent and the cooking area. Something had picked up a 50-pound salt block and moved it approximately 30 feet from its original position without tipping it or breaking it or disturbing the wooden platform it sat on. Don had not filed a report with the Forest Service. He had told his 2 guides, both of whom he trusted, to say nothing about it to their clients. He had thought about it for 7 years, he said, before I happened to ask the question that let him tell someone. He said he was not a man who talked about things he could not explain because in his experience those conversations went badly for the person doing the talking. But he thought, given who he was talking to and what he knew about my career, that I would understand what he was telling me and treat it appropriately. I told him I would. I told him I understood completely. He said one more thing before we ended the call. He said that in the years after the salt block incident, he had started paying attention differently when he moved his horse parties through the drainage, not looking for anything specific, more a quality of presence in the country, like the country was occupied in a way he had not registered before he understood what might be occupying it. He said once he understood that the feeling was consistent, and he had adjusted his camp practices, salt blocks inside the cook tent at night, care about camp placement relative to tree lines on benches above watercourses. He had not had another incident. I thanked him for telling me. He said he figured it was the right time. I said, I thought so too. I have told everything I know. The photographs from the spotted bear in '94, the field notes from the Gordon Creek drainage, Roy's journals, Karen's research, Don Seibert's horse camp, and the night on the gravel bar in August of 2017, which is the event that made all the rest of it speakable. Lily is coming back to the Bob Marshall with me this August. She will be 15. She will ask the question she has been carrying since she was 9 years old, in the place where it belongs to be asked, and whether the country answers her or not, she will have asked it honestly, and I will have been there with her. And that is enough. A 68-year-old man who spent his working life in that country, and a 15-year-old girl who saw something at 8 years old she has been trying to understand ever since, sitting on a gravel bar above the South Fork of the Flathead River, watching the timber on the bench above them in the last of the summer light. The country will do what it does. It always does.